of the Jewish state. Professor Wistrich.
I regret that for unforeseen reasons I wasn't able to hear the first part of this evening, but I did come in time to see some of the familiar culprits in the present day wave of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel hatred, demonization of the Jewish state, and indeed anti-Semitism that is, I regret to say, all too familiar to one like myself, who grew up in Great Britain, who went to school there, to university, and left, thankfully, in 1982, so that I've been able to view much of what I assume has been said thus far with a certain detachment. And that is a relief, because I find, as a student of anti-Semitism, that the British variety, which does have some special characteristics, is a peculiarly unpleasant one. I would not have said this 20 years ago. At that time, I went back to Britain for a couple of years, holding a position at University College London simultaneously with my responsibilities at the Hebrew University. And in retrospect, that was probably the best time in the post-war era, or one of the best times, to be in Britain and in some way to be representing Israel. But it was a fleeting episode. Had I been asked at that time, where would Britain stand 20 years later in the league table of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel feeling in Europe, I would not have assumed it would be as high as it stands today. And for those of you who just want a statistical confirmation, we had it very recently when the Community Security Trust, CST, released the figures for 2014 of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK, and the number was above 1,000, which was the all-time record since they began registering these things. And they do that in a very, I would say, meticulous way. The British statistics on anti-Semitism only accept very well-documented cases. And you have to take into account of these 1,000 plus incidents in 2014, they are always, in every country, underreported. In other words, the real number of incidents was far higher. And that explains to a large degree why we've had in recent months increasing reports from Great Britain of the number of Anglo-Jews not known for being panicky by any, in any shape or form, discussing whether they have a future in Great Britain. That is something relatively new. I don't recall any such discussions in the past among Anglo-Jews. And although the situation is not comparable for the time being to France, in other words, we haven't seen a great spike in the Aliyah figures. They have risen, but they've risen moderately. There's no doubt that something has changed. Since the summer of 2014, I believe, nothing will quite be what it was before, even in Great Britain. Now, one remark that always struck me with regard to the peculiarity of British anti-Semitism, which was addressed in a very long book by a colleague, a friend of mine of sorts, Anthony Julius, well-known lawyer, literary critic, and student of anti-Semitism, he noted, and I think that's based on a similar personal experience to my own, that in Britain, anti-Semitism tends to take the form of the insidious slur, the deprecating insult, the rather condescending and slighting remark, very stereotypical usually, and nevertheless taken for granted, and often expressed in a way that suggests that the person that does it is perhaps not even aware of what they're doing, although you can never be sure about that. And I think that somewhat extends to the problem we have in analyzing the British media. Because no media anywhere in the world operate in a vacuum. The question remains, and it's very hard to answer, does the British media or any of the rest of the Western media, when it comes to Israel and how they portray and represent it, does it reflect popular attitudes or what is imagined to be popular attitudes, or does it rather shape them? Does it create the agenda, or does it reflect an agenda that's created elsewhere? At the popular level, I have to say, and this is a feeling that's grown over the years, and not just based on conversations with taxi drivers from Heathrow Airport, I do feel that there is a growing gap between what your average man in the street in Great Britain might feel about Israel if pressed, to the extent they have any thoughts or feelings, and what we see reported, and the commentaries which have been alluded to, particularly in the mainstream British press and the so-called quality press. I would certainly dispute its quality when we look at some of the examples in the treatment of Israel. But what is this gap? I don't honestly believe that the average Briton, and for the moment I'm putting, for the moment, Muslims aside, because that is a special case, and I'll come to it, that the average Briton shares the kind of assumptions that seem to prevail in the so-called thinking person's media, or in the BBC. But they are influenced by it nonetheless, because the pictures, the images that are shown, perhaps even more than the words, create an agenda. Many years ago, back in 1933, when Hitler came to power, a well-known British politician, a diplomat, and a literateur called Harold Nicolson made a remark that I've never forgotten, because I thought it captured something about the duplicity of the British in these matters. He said, "I loathe anti-Semitism, but I do dislike Jews." To which I'm tempted to reply, I loathe British anti-Semitism, and I really dislike the British more and more. And I say this as somebody who owes quite a lot, which I'm more than willing to recognize, to British education as it once was, but no longer is. And I think Nicholson captured something. Another commentator on that, and Julius brings this out in his book, remarked that British anti-Semitism is really anti-Semitism with the boots off. That's the big difference between Britain and Germany. Particularly in the 30s, that was obvious. You had the Nazi jackboots. And so a man like Nicholson, who really disliked Jews in a kind of aristocratic, condescending way, could be horrified by these SA thugs going around beating up Jews, because that's the kind of thing that's just not done. And in Britain, it's always been very important. What is done and what is not done. I think that bearing that in mind, we should look again at one of the most malevolent of the parallels that is consistently drawn in British media to this day regarding Israel. And that is basically the Nazi parallel. That we here in Israel, we Jews in Israel, behave and conduct ourselves, particularly towards the Palestinians, as the Nazis conducted themselves towards the Jews. This is a much beloved parallel among certain sections of the British media. Of course, it's not exclusive to Britain. This has now become a global disease. When certain detailed studies were made, in Germany in particular, only a couple of years ago, about Europeans, at least 9 European countries were investigated to see how this parallel actually works in surveys. And the results were astounding and shocking. Britain was not the worst offender, but it was well up there. Close to 40% of Britons thought it's true to say that the Israelis treat the Palestinians like the Nazis treated the Jews. There were some countries where it was even worse. Poland, despite the good bilateral relations between Poland and Israel, it was over 50%. Hungary was high. Germany was higher than Britain. Nevertheless, close to 40% of Britons thought that. Now, the origins of that actually go back a long way. And here is a point I think we must bear in mind, even if the British media rarely address it. And that is the obvious fact that Britain held the Palestine Mandate. And even if the present generation and those in the media today who call the tune and the politicians don't feel any obligation to that, don't necessarily recall the history of that mandate, it left, I think, a deep mark. And in my own research, I discovered that the Nazi Zionist parallel was actually a British invention. I used to think when I first embarked on my studies, in the 1970s, I began my own research as a student. And I began with the Soviet Union because I knew Russian, and it happened to be the first job I was given as a researcher to read the Russian-Soviet press. And of course, in the 1970s, the Nazi Zionist parallel was rampant all over the Soviet media. It was a state-controlled, totalitarian device, very consciously used in domestic and foreign policy by the USSR and all its satellites. Just as the apartheid state was a Soviet construct of the 1970s. And many other things. Zionism is racism before it got to the United Nations. But the British preceded the Soviets in the 1940s in their war against Zionism, and that's what it was. Let's not forget this. From 1939 onwards, from the time of the British White Paper, despite World War II, and despite the famous saying of Ben-Gurion, you know, that the Yishuv will conduct itself as if there is no white paper and it will fight on Britain's side. But at the same time, it will oppose the white paper as if there was no war going on. But the British, from their angle, they saw the Zionists as a real threat. And they conducted a very harsh policy. They kept the gates of Palestine slammed shut throughout the war years, during the years of the Nazi Inferno, to make sure that not a single Jew would escape from Nazi-controlled Europe, if possible. They couldn't completely seal it off, but they did their damn best. And during that time, there was a propaganda war that Britain fought And part of that war, and you look at the documents that are available, and it goes from the top down, from the British Colonial Office, the British Foreign Office, the colonial administration in Palestine, the British administration, the people in charge here, the British Army. They branded the Zionist movement as a Nazi movement. They compared the youth movements in this country with the Hitler Youth. And these parallels, which were utterly baseless, were nevertheless, whether they were believed or not, I can't tell you. But in the documents, they show up all the time. And later in the 1950s, and then in the 60s, when I was a student at Cambridge, and I remember reading for the first time a study of history by Arnold Toynbee, who was considered a great British scholar of history, philosopher of history. He was extremely popular at that time. And there are these appalling chapters in Toynbee's work about Zionism and the establishment of Israel, in which he calls the establishment of Israel the greatest crime against humanity, one that even is worse in his eyes than the monstrous Nazi crimes of World War II. And Arnold Toynbee was no leftist. This kind of thinking was taken over by whole swathes of the left, primarily after 1967. And of course, it's never gone away. The Trotskyists, the communists, the anarchists, the anti-globalists, all the myriad different sects that flourished on the left of the spectrum. But it's not confined to the left. And today there are plenty of liberals and so-called enlightened intellectuals, and conservatives too. And in Britain, they love this parallel. Sometimes people try to explain this in other European contexts by saying this is an attempt to project the latent guilt that Europeans feel for the Holocaust onto Israel, because this is a way of shifting the burden by saying, oh, you Israeli Jews, you're no better than us. In fact, you're even worse, because you didn't learn the lessons of history that we, supposedly, we Europeans, have learned. That's quite common. If a German or a French person takes that line, you might conceivably suspect there could be an element of that. But the British have a good conscience about World War II. It was their finest hour. In fact, they're always looking back with nostalgia, not just to the empire, but to that finest hour when they stood alone, which is true. They did. They had a heroic moment, particularly in 1940. And yet, that coincided with what, in retrospect, and not just from a Jewish point of view, must be seen as an astonishingly inhuman policy that they adopted through those years, and which continued right through to the establishment of Israel in 1948. Britain tried to abort that. And what is often forgotten and never mentioned in the British media is in 1947 there were actually some mini pogroms in the UK itself, quite apart from the rampant anti-Semitism that was present in the British Army when it was repressing the Jewish underground and fight for independence in those years. Some of you may remember the commander-in-chief of British forces in Palestine in 1946, Evelyn Barker, Lieutenant General Evelyn Barker, who ordered British forces in Tel Aviv and in all other areas of Jewish settlement not to fraternize, not to have any contact with the Jews, because we want to hit them in their pockets where it upsets them most. This race, he talked about the Jews as a race that were unworthy of, even unworthy of the mandate. Well, that is background. Today, there was a big shift that has gone steadily forward in the last 30, 35 years, whereby anti-Zionism became increasingly the province of the left, not just the far left, the intellectuals, the academics, to some extent even the Anglican Church has been infected, and many other groupings, I would say, of the more elite opinion-forming groups in Britain, who regard Israel increasingly, not just as was said here, rightly and shockingly, of course, a nation of child murderers, an army of child murderers, but actually as a criminal entity, as a permanent, systematic violator of international law, of human rights, as an exemplar of racism itself. I have to tell you, as someone who grew up in Britain, I consider even the worst racists in this country, and I've met quite a few, and they certainly exist, and they need to be fought. But I've never experienced anything close to British racism, which is, I would say, 100 times more palpable, particularly when you scratch the surface. And when you look at the historical record, and particularly of the British Empire. So that these lessons of morality, which Britain, like the Scandinavian nations, is renowned for, these outbursts of moral indignation about a country like Israel, I think we should step back a little and look more closely at those who are expressing this kind of superior, higher moral ground of judgment. Even when you look just at the record of Palestine, the way that the British crushed and repressed the Palestinians, the Palestinian Arabs, because there were Jewish Palestinians then as well, in between 1936 and 1939, particularly in the last 2 years of the Great Arab Revolt. Nothing that Tzahal has ever done even remotely comes close to that. The way they sent in the RAF to strafe whole Arab villages, the way they hung all the leaders of the revolt. And they did this in many places. This is never addressed. What's addressed is the betrayal by Britain, supposedly, of the Arabs. Not the fact that they betrayed the Jews in 1939, but that the Balfour Declaration was this original sin, which now has to be purged. And one of the ways of purging it is this relentless, non-stop, moralistic, and I think very two-faced kind of commentary that we get from the so-called quality press. Having said all that, I think it's important, since I have 5 minutes, to stress, and this is a ray of light, if you like, in that particular British gloom. at the present time, and actually for a number of years now, fortunately for Anglo-Jews, the people who actually run Britain, and well, particularly the prime ministers of Britain, the last three, have been as philo-Semitic and philo-Zionist as you can be in British terms. In other words, I'm referring to Mr. Tony Blair, his successor Gordon Brown, and the present incumbent, David Cameron. That doesn't mean their record is spot clean, but we can't judge them by purely Zionist criteria. In relative terms, it's hard to think of prime ministers who were more sympathetic in a hostile climate. Yes, Mrs. Thatcher was the first, certainly the first conservative leader to introduce a large number of Jews into her cabinet. She was instinctively quite sympathetic to Zionism, but nevertheless was restrained by the Foreign Office. Winston Churchill is remembered as a great Zionist, but he kept the white paper throughout the wartime years. Let's remember that too. And of course, we go back to Lloyd George, Balfour, and that whole tradition, which was impressive, in some ways unique, except for the United States. There was no other country that had such a philo-Zionist tradition initially. But we see with Cameron and his predecessors that despite this very hostile climate, which I think has nurtured and encouraged and fostered anti-Semitism in Britain, that those people at the top, for various reasons, have not been unduly influenced by it. My last remarks pertain to the changing demography of Britain as of Europe. Today, there are approximately 3.3 million Muslims living in Britain out of a population of 63 million. The Jewish population is down to about 250,000. So the Jews are 0.4% of the British population. The Muslims are 5.4%, but rising. All the projections show in the younger age groups where we will be 15, 20, 30 years' time. Already, the most popular boy's name in Great Britain is Mohammed. What is going to happen, particularly regarding the Jews? I won't talk about what will happen to British society, although they are becoming increasingly concerned, as are other Europeans. But for the Jews, so far, I'm not saying this is Gzerat HaGoral, but so far the news has not been particularly bright. The prospect, as in other European countries, is that even if you have only a small minority of jihadi-influenced, young, alienated radicals from the Muslim community, they can completely undermine the security, the stability, and the future of the Jewish community in Britain. It certainly could happen. I think it's well understood today that this is a rather dire prospect. Nobody quite knows how this might be resolved. There is interfaith dialogue. It's sporadic. It's not very influential. There are some attempts to bridge the gap. There are here and there some common interests. Nevertheless, it's a grave problem, and one that has aggravated the latent and the more overt anti-Semitism of the majority society, because it entered politics. Today, you have a factor that never existed before, that politicians in Britain, as in other European countries, take into account their sense that their Muslim electorate will appreciate a strong anti-Israel position, and this is factored in very often to the statements that they are willing to make. And that is a new factor that didn't previously exist. So overall, we can say Britain, the mother of parliaments, land of liberal toleration, freedom of speech, and many other virtues, democracy, has become a very problematic homeland, even for the Jews. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wistrich, for that very erudite analysis of both ends of the spectrum, the